start looking at some of the lines of evidence for change and some of the mechanisms for change, starting at longer timescales for this lecture, and then for the rest of the course moving on to progressively shorter timescales. But just to recap what we did last time, we spent quite a lot of time both in the lecture and in the kind of reading stuff, wasn't really reading, it was watching, beforehand, how we can take a simple energy balance where we're looking at fluxes of energy into and out of the system and just balancing them at the top of the atmosphere and the bottom of the atmosphere so that we can come up with these simple models of surface temperature or emission temperature, the temperature at the top of the atmosphere. And we were showing that the temperature of the surface of the Earth is really just down to the temperature, well, the power of the sun, or how much solar energy, how much solar energy we receive at the Earth's surface. The shininess of the planet, albedo, and the emissivity of the atmosphere, or the tendency of the atmosphere to absorb kind of the outgoing long-wave radiation. So that is the E, or epsilon term in those equations. We then looked at how that energy was actually really distributed across the Earth. So the climate really can't be described as just that one parameter. It's not just a single temperature. There's a lot of temperature variability across the whole planet. Okay, the tropics are warmer than the poles. There's kinds of spatial variability in terms of continents versus ocean. And this leads to ultimately an imbalance between the tropics and the polar regions, in that there's more energy arriving in the tropics than is leaving. And in the poles, there's more that is leaving than is arriving. So there must be a flow of energy from the tropics to the poles, and that's what drives our weather. There we go. Right, drives our weather. And then we also looked in a little bit of detail, not a lot of detail, about some of the structure in the components of the Earth system, the atmosphere and the ocean. And really importantly for the ocean, it's kind of blown around at the surface by the winds. We've got all these kind of funky little patterns of eddies and strong currents like the Gulf Stream here. But really importantly, we looked at the ocean. It's heated from the sun and from the atmosphere, which are traditionally above the ocean. And that leads to a very warm surface layer of the ocean, which is kind of buoyant, and that sits on top of a much colder, denser, deep ocean, which is bigger, but importantly does not really interact so much with the atmosphere, because it's basically got a lid on it of the surface ocean. Yeah. So we're going to start now looking at basically, I'm saying that like the climate changes and we've got this model or stuff like that, but what is the evidence for it? Okay, how do we know? Okay, so the first part of this lecture will be looking at some of this evidence for climate change. So we can't kind of go back in time. We can't go back in time and measure like the climate in the past, because we can't time travel. We can time travel, but only forwards in time, not backwards. Because that's how time works. Anyway, whatever. Right. So we've got to use information that we can get from the present that tells us something about the past. And these things are we call them climate proxies. So a proxy is just an indirect measure of something, and it doesn't necessarily have to be even something looking into the past. Okay. In the context of climate, though, we can use a variety of different lines of evidence. So that the first kind of thing that I guess quite a lot of you have been on the Earth Dynamics field trip to Pease Bay. Okay, in the first place we went to, we saw that big red sandstone. Yeah, so that big red sandstone. Okay, that was a desert environment where that was deposited. Okay, it was arid. Okay, there were no plants in it. Okay. So we can use evidence from rocks to tell us about the climate. So if we see a kind of a big red sandstone with like dune cross-bedding, that might say, oh, that was a desert. or if we find some coal deposits with some kind of limestones, we might say, oh, that was maybe a kind of a tropical delta top, so that might have been a warm and wet environment. So we can use information just from the character of rocks to tell us about what the climate was in that particular area in the past. We can also use biological information, so fossils, basically. So if you go on a field trip to Antarctica, which highly recommend, lots of fun, not done it myself, but, you know, maybe one day, you can go there and you can find fossils of crocodiles in Antarctica. Okay, crocodiles not so keen on the cold weather. So this is telling us that in the past, Antarctica was a warmer place, okay, when those crocodiles were living there. So it's not just kind of like the Steve Brusati fancy enormous fossils. We can also look at microfossils that tell us about the environment in which those organisms lived, and they can tell us something about the climate. It's not just the type of organism, so it's not just like there are crocodiles or there are narwhals, right, living in cold and warm places. We can also use individual characters of organisms as well. So one of the proxies that's been used quite a lot for reconstructing past atmospheric carbon dioxide is this thing called stomatal density on fossil leaves. So if you look very closely at a microscope image of a leaf, which I probably should have got an image of, but I don't, some of the cells have got holes in. Okay? This is how gases can get inside the leaf, so the plant can do its photosynthesis and it can respire and basically breathe out oxygen and CO2 when it's respiring, and it can get CO2 in from the atmosphere. And it turns out that the number of those holes on a leaf in any one kind of area or any one number of cells is related to the atmospheric CO2 concentration. So we can basically just count the holes in a leaf and use that as an indirect measure of the atmospheric CO2 concentration. Yes. And then the last category is chemical information. So rather than kind of looking at the number of organisms or the type of organisms or the number of scratches on an ammonite's arse or something like that, we can look at the chemistry of sediments or the chemistry of fossils to tell us something about the environment they were deposited in. So the examples here, we can actually use the isotopes of oxygen to tell us something about past ice volume or temperature. We'll talk a little bit about the mechanisms of that in a future slide. But I guess for this course, the detailed mechanisms of how these proxy works don't really matter. Okay? It's more important to know that there are proxies out there that can be used to reconstruct a variety of different environments. I have posted a video on Learn, not one of mine, but one of somebody else's, which is better, which just basically goes over an overview of how that works, if you're interested. It's wrong. It's not really how it works. I explain it much better in a third-year course called Geochemistry, but, you know, that's for the future. Yeah, so I guess I've already kind of like touched on this for the rock types. So desert sandstone might indicate that that was from a desert. Okay, so it might be warm and arid. You need to be quite careful, because if you're looking really, really far back in time, if we find a wind-blown sandstone deposit, so it's got these big, enormous dune cross beds in it, there's no evidence of plants. But if we found that in an Ordovician sediment, okay, then trees had not evolved. There were no land plants. So it might not be indicative of a particularly warm or dry environment. It might just be that it was on land and, you know, there's no plants around to make it not like a wind-blown, barren, deserty thing. Right. So you need to be a little bit careful when looking back in time, because the conditions of the, I guess, our present relationships between kind of environment and kind of sedimentary setting might not be the same through all of geological time. But for the most of it, I mean, when you see a coal deposit, that's usually in a warm climate where you have lots of trees growing and then decaying in swamps, particularly if you have evaporites forming, so things like salt, gypsum. They're indicative of an environment where there's lots of evaporation, so it would usually have to be quite hot for that. And if you find glacial deposits, so this can be kind of like the landscape features, because they don't actually have to be rocks, but you could have the landscape features like we see all over Scotland, or the sediments that are deposited by glaciers, so glacial moraines and tills, or even drop stones. So we have glaciers that have icebergs have basically carved off the front of them, and those have floated out into the sea or into a lake. They will basically, when they melt, they will just drop rocks out of those icebergs into sediments that usually would normally have been just fine grained. And they usually make big, enormous holes in the sediments. So you can see these impact structures. So if you see those kind of deposits, then that might make you think, oh, well, this bit of the Earth was glaciated at that time. So the important, well, one of the many important things, though, is that you need to consider where your rocks are if you want to reconstruct climate. Okay? Because at any one time in the past, the Earth has got lots of different positions on it where rocks can form. Okay? So if we just take the present for an example, okay, we've got the climate that we have now, but we might have rocks that are forming in a desert environment. We might have glacial deposits being formed down here. We have evaporites being formed here and here, maybe around the Persian Gulf. We'll have deep sea sediments, which aren't really telling us much at all about climate. We'll have a huge range of, we might have coal being deposited in the Amazon basin, in the Niger basin. There's a huge range of different climates on Earth now, so there'll be a huge different range of rock types being deposited now. So you need to think, or you need to be able to reconstruct where on the planet that rock was formed to be able to say anything about whether the climate at that time was anything different from the present. It could just be that we're finding, so if we go back to the Carboniferous in Edinburgh, we find coal deposits, we find kind of warm, swampy, shallow sea deposits. Okay? Does that mean that the planet was warmer at that time? Not necessarily. It's just because Scotland was on the equator, or near the equator. Okay? It turns out that the Carboniferous was actually a period of global cooling, so the whole planet on average was colder at that time. It just happens that the rocks that are preserved here are showing that it was warmer than it is now. Okay? And that's just because we're in a different place. So rock type is very useful, but you need to know something about where like that bit of the Earth was in relation to the equator. And that's true of almost all proxies, okay, that are recording the local conditions. Okay? Some proxies do record kind of global conditions, but most proxies are recording locally. And that's really important to consider, because local climate is not global, because it obviously isn't. One of the like main places that we get paleoclimate information is the ocean, and that's largely because the ocean provides a very continuous sedimentary record, because sediments are continuously deposited in the ocean. We don't have gaps, or we don't have many gaps in sedimentation. So we can take a big ship like this one, which is French, which is nice, and we basically drop a big steel barrel core into the seabed, and we can pull out a big long section of mud, which has got, well, if we're lucky, it will have layers in, so we can work out the age. There are many other ways of working out the age. And then from that sediment, we can extract a number of things. So the sediment in the deep ocean is largely made up of very fine clays, silts from the land, okay? But is largely made up of fossils of plankton that's fallen down to the seabed. Now those fossil plankton are useful because we can then measure their populations. We can look at what kinds of plankton we have, and that might tell us something about the conditions in the surface ocean at the time. Or we can actually measure the chemistry or the isotopes of their skeletons. Their skeletons of this particular kind of plankton are called tests. It doesn't really matter what the word is, but they grow a little shell made of hard mineral that we can measure. So these are some of those. So this is a foraminifera. We've got a coccolith here. I think this is a radiolarian, and this is something else. But these are very small. Okay, so these are all electron microscope images of these individual plankton. And we can use these as proxies. So this is an example of using the populations of these different types of plankton. So here are two basically versions of the same species. I guess we're losing when you get down to these are single cellular organisms that kind of live inside this little hole and they grow in this little shell around them. So when you're down to kind of like single-celled organisms, the term species is quite fluid. But anyway, so there's this particular Neoglobuquadrina pachyderma that's really not worth learning. And it has two versions. Okay, so it has a version that likes to coil its shell up this way and another one that likes to do it this way. Okay, so it has a lefty coiling and a righty coiling version. So what you can do is you can do what we call a proxy calibration. Okay, so we notice that at very cold temperatures, when you go out and kind of scoop up the plankton out of the ocean, you tend to only find the left coiling kind of version, whereas you go to very warm bits of the ocean, you only find the right coiling version. Okay? So we think, oh, right, if we look at the ratio, or we can basically count the number of these and count the number of those, and we can figure out, basically, when we go out to the ocean, in places of the ocean that have got different temperatures, we find that these things grow in different ratios of one to another. Okay, so what we've done, we've basically gone to places where we know the temperature, and we've measured the biological population. And then we can then use that in places that we don't know the temperature. So with the past, we can go to some sediment, and we can basically just count the number of righties versus the number of lefties, and then we can basically just read off this graph what the temperature is. Okay? So the first thing to note with this is that there are some problems with using proxies like this, in that what we've done is we've done what we call an empirical calibration. So we have no underlying knowledge about why they do this, okay? But we have found that we can produce basically a calibration line by looking at data that we know the temperature and we know the ratios. Now, one of the problems with that is that that relationship might not be true in other places. There might be some other factors that are affecting this lefty-rightiness. And if you look closely here, if you look at data from the North Atlantic, which are in blue, and the South Atlantic in red, we get a slightly different kind of curve to calibrate the temperatures on. Okay? But you might say, well, I'll do a local calibration for my particular study, and I'll just stick to the North Atlantic and it'll be fine. But then we don't really know that this relationship is completely true through all of geological time. Okay? The response, this response has arisen through evolutionary processes, right? Otherwise it wouldn't happen, wouldn't exist. So there's no reason to suspect that that evolutionary process hasn't been happening over time and this relationship has been changing. So knowing that the relationship is fixed through time is an important assumption. The other problem with this proxy is that it saturates at high temperature and low temperature. So it doesn't work over all temperatures. So it's only useful between 4 and maybe 14 degrees Celsius. Beyond that, you can only say it's hotter or colder than that. Okay? So not all proxies have this problem of non-linearity, but some do. We just need to be aware of that. Okay? So that's a biological kind of assemblage proxy. There is this proxy, series of proxies for temperature based on the oxygen isotopes in forams, or the magnesium-calcium ratio of the calcium carbonate. And you can see here that I've just put that these things that we might be able to measure in a shell using kind of chemistry techniques are dependent on temperature, are a function of temperature, but are also a function of lots of other things. Okay? So if we wanted to know temperature, we'd need to know something about ice volume, salinity, and calcification rate before we could then calculate what temperature was from that thing. Okay? Sometimes we could just maybe ignore these things and just assume that they don't change, and then look at the temperature change. So there are many things that can affect our proxies other than the thing that we actually want to know, which is annoying, which might mean that we just have to measure lots of proxies to correct for all of these controlling factors. Another problem is this idea of seasonal bias. So if you take some sediment from one of these marine sediment cores, the sedimentation rates are usually quite slow, maybe a couple of centimeters per 1,000 years. So when you get like a little slice of sediment, that will be averaging together a number of years of plankton falling down to the water column. Now, it's not averaging equally across all of those years. Okay? If the plankton, if you had like one shell of plankton grow every month, yeah, and then fall to the bottom of the ocean, then yeah, it would be averaging the temperature over those number of years. But that's not how plankton work. Right? They tend to grow more in spring and summer than in winter. So what you're actually recording in the sediment is strongly biased towards kind of spring and summer temperatures, whereas it might be very cold in the winter, but there'll be no plankton growing in the water column, so you won't get any temperatures from that time preserved in your sediment. So there can be a strong seasonal bias in proxies. Okay, and I've already mentioned that your calibration might not be valid through time, which is a bummer. This is the slide I was mentioning on oxygen isotopes. I'm not going to dwell on this too much because there's a video that kind of really explains it in much more clearly than I can right now. But essentially, oxygen isn't just kind of, well, it's an element that has a number of different isotopes. So these are basically the same atoms of the same element. They just have different numbers of neutrons in their nuclei, so they weigh different amounts. So we have oxygen 16, 17, and 18. We can pretty much ignore oxygen 17 because that's hardly ever used in geosciences. It is, but it's not. It's not. Just ignore it. It's not there. But so these different atoms behave chemically the same because they have the same number of electrons out the side, except they don't really behave chemically the same. There's a slight difference in the chemistry of reactions that involve light isotopes and heavy isotopes, which leads to the products or the reactants being either enriched or depleted in heavier or light isotopes. And those processes are dependent on temperature, so we can use it as a temperature proxy. But the thing to remember for this course is that, so we will be using oxygen isotopes as a proxy for lots of different kind of things in the climate, that it is affected by two main things. Okay? The first thing is that it is affected by just take a step back. So the thing that we usually measure the oxygen isotopes in are these plankton shells, usually in foraminifera, because they're very abundant. And these are little things that live in the water. Okay? So the isotope composition that's preserved in the shell is dependent on the isotope composition of the water. And the water composition changes with how much ice is locked up on land. So that's due to when you evaporate water, you preferentially evaporate the lighter isotopes. That means that when we've got lots of ice, the oxygen isotopes of the water will be heavier. So we'll have this delta O18 will be more positive, okay, because delta O18 is a way of expressing isotope ratios relative to a standard rather than the absolute ratio, because we can't actually measure the absolute ratio of isotopes very well at all. We can only measure the difference relative to a standard. So we use this delta notation. And the other thing about this delta notation is that you'll notice that it's basically the ratio of ratios of things we can't actually measure absolutely, but we can measure them relative to each other. So we can measure that. But the differences are quite small, like really small. So we just times this number by 1,000 to make the numbers more dealable with. So when this is positive, that means we've got more oxygen 18 in that sample. When it's more negative, we have more oxygen 16. So when seawater evaporates and goes away and plays on an ice sheet, the water left behind has a delta 18O that's more positive. Okay, so that's right. And also, when you precipitate calcium carbonate from that water, the colder it is, the heavier the isotopes will be in the calcium carbonate compared to the water. So cold conditions lead to you having more positive delta O18, and also will lead to there being more ice, because it's colder, okay, and that ice will be on land, which leads to the water being more positive. Okay, so coldness leads to basically more ice on land and more heavier isotopes in the water, and more coldness also means the heavier isotopes will be in the carbonate. So those processes quite often combine so that we can just use oxygen isotopes as a combined proxy of coldness and ice volume. Okay? And just to point out, and we'll point this out when I show some plots, that quite often the vertical axis on proxy diagram plots is upside down. Okay? And that's so we can make up warmer, right? Whereas down is colder in terms of the proxy interpretation. And we'll come on to that when we look at some examples. So the other thing that we've got a lot of information from for the past climate are ice cores. So both on ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica, but also in glaciers at more equatorial latitudes. So the thing is, this is a bit of an ice sheet that's kind of breaking off into the ocean, and you can see these layers kind of in the ice showing that it's accumulating kind of vertically. So we can use that to work out like how old the ice is, and we can drill into it and extract kind of basically long records, continuous, because snows every year in Antarctica and in Greenland. And if we look closely at that ice, okay, there are a number of things that we can measure in it. And the first thing to notice is that the ice cores, or ice from ice sheets, is not completely solid ice. Okay? These are individual ice crystals. Okay? And you can see some of the grain boundaries, there are bubbles. And these are formed when the snow basically falls. The snow is quite porous. Okay? So there's lots of air gaps in the snow. And then as that snow is compact, those air gaps get kind of squashed and isolated, and they eventually become these bubbles. So these bubbles are capturing the past atmosphere of the Earth. Okay? So we can measure the gases in these bubbles. Okay? So we can measure the content of CO2, of other trace gases. We can measure the isotopic compositions of those gases. Now, strictly speaking, those measurements of the gas bubbles are not proxies. Okay? Because that is a direct measurement of the past atmosphere. Okay? We've basically got a bit of the atmosphere, we've put it in a time capsule, okay, and it's now travelled through time, it's in the present, and we can measure it. Okay? Whereas other things, I guess you could also say that the dust, if you're measuring how dusty it was, the dust in the ice, that's also not a proxy. Okay? But other things, we can measure things in the water, so we can measure the isotopic composition of the water, we can measure some impurities in the water, maybe measure chlorine as a proxy of how much volcanism there's been. We could measure, all these kind of things. And those are proxies, because the isotope composition of water is not it's not a proxy, it's a direct measurement of the isotope composition of water, but it would then be used as a proxy for something else, local temperature. Maybe something you might be more familiar with, tree rings, we can use as a proxy for temperature. So when it's warm, and when there's enough water around for that tree to grow, it will grow a nice thick ring, whereas in cooler, maybe drier years, we might get thinner rings being produced. And we can basically count back how old the tree is, using counting, and get a record of warmness over however long that tree has lived. Okay? We can then use that pattern of warm, dry, warm, dry, warm, dry, and then get maybe a record from a fossil tree or a tree from a building that has been, chopped down hundreds of years ago, and match up those records so they overlap, so we can match up the warm, cold, warm, cold, warm, cold. So we don't have to have a tree, a single tree, that has lived tens of thousands of years. We can overlap many fossil trees to build up a record of climate over thousands of years, okay, in a particular region. And this is kind of what's happened here. So we don't have to have a tree that's kind of like 300 years old. Okay, we can splice together these records. So I think we've got the blue curve here is a measure of effectively ring thickness. And the red curve is a measure of the actual local temperature recorded. And you can see that the temperature and the tree ring kind of matches quite well. So that gives us confidence that that is a good proxy for past temperatures. And then we can take this record further back in time. There we go, there's some corals. I guess just like with the plankton, forams that live in the ocean, we can also measure the chemistry of other things that produce a hard mineral shell or skeleton. So one of the things that people have done a lot of work on in this department and also, I guess, elsewhere, are these large corals which grow in layers every year. So this is a section through one of those. You can see the annual layers in the corals. And we can then measure the chemistry of these skeletons in terms of their elemental composition or their isotope composition, and use those measurements as proxies of past surface temperature. So this is an example from the Great Barrier Reef, where we're looking at corals which we haven't actually counted the layers back 15,000 years, because corals don't live that long. But what we've been able to do, we're able to actually date the corals independently using radioactive techniques. And then measuring the oxygen isotopes and the strontium to calcium ratio, which we're using as a proxy for temperature. Okay? And we can see here that across this interval, we have a dramatic drop in temperature from kind of 10,000 years ago to kind of 20,000 years ago. Okay? So this is the last glacial maximum. So this deglacial period, there was a dramatic period of warming across the Great Barrier Reef. So I've just mentioned the dating. So dating is almost as important as understanding the proxy in terms of figuring out what the temperature was or the precipitation or whatever parameter we're trying to reconstruct. Okay? And we need to do some understanding of how that proxy works in the modern environment, that proxy calibration, okay, to get an accurate y-axis. But if we want to reconstruct climate back through time, we also need to care about this x-axis. Okay, so I mentioned that we could use radioactive decay techniques. So, for instance, with a coral, okay, that's made of calcium carbonate, we could maybe use the carbon content to figure out how old that coral is, using radiocarbon dating. For older things, we might use kind of maybe uranium lead dating, which might be able to date minerals that are, the age of the Earth and beyond. There are lots of different techniques around. But the one that you choose to use will be a combination of kind of the age range you're looking at. So there's no use using radiocarbon to date something that's 1 million years old, because all of the radiocarbon will have decayed away. Likewise, there's no point using uranium lead dating to date something that's maybe a few hundred years old, because the precision of the technique would just give you an age of plus or minus, thousands of years. Okay. So you can get absolute dates of things by basically radiometrically dating them. But you can also use techniques like this, where we're basically looking to correlate one time scale onto another record. So we don't actually measure the age of anything in our record. We're just looking at the wiggle of climate proxy that we produce. So in this case, measuring the isotope composition of calcite in a speleothem, and that's in red. And we're basically looking at, we know that there's a global pattern in kind of that particular proxy that looks like the black curve, Okay, and we would then just match our red curve to our black curve to basically transfer a known age onto an unknown kind of proxy record. Okay, so what we're going to do now is that's basically introduce the idea that we can use these proxies to tell us something about past climate. We're going to look now at some examples of what's been driving climate change over these really long time scales. So I asked you to watch hopefully that video about weathering, and that's going to form hopefully part of the explanation for these long-term changes. So this is one of these proxy records. So this is a compilation of data from the whole kind of Earth of stuff that's been formed in the ocean, looking at the oxygen isotope composition. And notice I mentioned that the scale is flipped upside down, so we've got -3 at the top, +3 at the bottom. So heavier isotopes are down. And that heavier isotopes, that means that there's either more ice locked up on land, leaving to heavier isotopes left behind the ocean, or it's colder, or both. Okay? So we can see through long periods of geological time there have been these changes when the Earth has been switching between periods when it was colder or more icy, or both, or warmer or ice-free, or both. Okay? So we can identify these kind of warm and cold areas, and we can basically match that up to our geological evidence. Okay, so we can look at sites around the world and we can find out where there were lots of glacially deposited rocks. Okay, so these periods, so I was talking about the Carboniferous, so I said that was a warm period if you were in Scotland, but Scotland was the equator. Globally, there were lots of glacial rocks being deposited elsewhere. So this was a period of cooling. We're in a period of cooling at the moment. We've got enormous ice sheets over 2 continents at the moment. There were, I guess, more like 20,000 years ago. There was a 3rd continent almost completely covered in ice. So we're matching together. So this gives us confidence in our kind of understanding because we've got 2 sets of proxies. We've got these oxygen isotopes and the geological evidence that are in agreement. So the question is, why is the climate changing over these very long timescales? Okay. So if we're looking for a reason for this climate change, we've got to think about what the timescale is. So I mentioned in the last lecture about timescales of different parts of the climate system, like the atmosphere could respond quite quickly, okay, and ice sheets could respond quite slowly. Okay, so we need to look at a part of the Earth system which changes over very long time scales to explain these long-term time thingies. So one of the things that acts over hundreds of millions of years is continental drift. So the continents kind of move around. They both move around relative to each other and also relative to the spin axis of the Earth. So this is a reconstruction of where the continents were about 400 million years ago. And superimposed on that is the position of the South Pole relative to those continents. Now, it's not saying that the South Pole has been moving. It's the continents have been moving relative to the South Pole. And you might think, well, so what? Right? I mean, who cares where the continents were, right? It turns out that it could matter where the continents are. Because if the planet gets a little bit colder, right, and you've got let's say you've got some continents over the pole, South Pole, and not over the North Pole. Okay? Imagine the whole planet is like getting colder by the same amount. Now, you can't grow an ice sheet on the North Pole because there's no continent there. So if you start freezing the ocean, the ice will just move away, right? And you won't be able to build up a large mass of ice. Whereas if you've got a continent over the pole, okay, you can build up an ice sheet because there's something for the ice to be on, and the continent is usually higher up than the ocean. And the higher up you go in the atmosphere, the colder it gets, okay? Which means that it's easier to grow an ice sheet. So it should be the case that if you have a continent over one of the poles, then it should be easier to grow an ice sheet. Okay? And if you can grow an ice sheet, that means that you'll have a bit of the Earth that is constantly covered in something that's white. Okay? And if you have something that's white, that will reflect lots of solar radiation away, which is effectively raising the albedo of the whole planet. Okay, if you change a little bit to whiteness, the whole average will go up, which means that the whole planet will cool. So you'll end up with a feedback process. You have a forcing of moving the continents over the pole, you then cool the planet, you grow an ice sheet, and then the feedback is that change in albedo will lead to more cooling. So we could look at some examples here. So this is some paleogeographic reconstructions of where the continents were in the late Jurassic. Okay, and you can see that the pole is free of ice, relatively free of ice up here. And this was a period of warmth. It was very warm in the Jurassic, okay, because of, it was. And we have, all the dinosaurs, they loved it, yeah, warm. Whereas in the late Carboniferous, okay, Scotland is, I think, in here somewhere, okay, maybe on the south. Anyway, we're in here somewhere. So we're on the equator. It's really warm for us, okay, but in the Carboniferous, one of these continents was near the pole, and a large ice sheet could develop on that, okay, which meant that the global temperature now, if we would just look at the average whiteness of these two maps, okay, this one is the whiter, yeah. So the albedo of this planet here would lead to a cooler average temperature. The problem is that that's not always true. Okay? So if the polar position of the continents does matter, like is a really strong, important thing, then every time there is a continent on the pole, we should expect there to be a period of extreme cooling. And if you look back to the Eocene, which is about 50 million years ago, we have a big continent on the South Pole, okay? And we have a teeny tiny ice sheet on it. This was one of the warmer periods in Earth history. So this doesn't fit our idea that the polar position of the continents matters. So maybe it does matter, but maybe not all of the time. Okay, so we could go and test our hypothesis that the polar position of continents matters. We could see different periods in Earth's time. Is there an ice sheet? Do we have, continents on the poles? And, is our hypothesis supported? And kind of, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Okay, so the mechanism here is this albedo, this feedback. Okay, so a forcing is the change which is completely independent of climate, which is moving the continents around. Okay? But the thing that's actually causing the bigger change is the feedback by changing our albedo. Okay, so we've got to think about something else then. If it's not the position of the cold continents, maybe it's another process. So the other process we could think about is maybe one of those other parameters in that equation. The one we're going to look at is the emissivity of the atmosphere. So these are the reservoirs of carbon in the Earth. These are the fluxes of carbon between different reservoirs. So you can see that the flux in between, like the atmosphere and vegetation, that's quite big. There's big changes in that flux. So that's going to change quite quickly. That's going to be something we're not really going to be looking at. But the changes into rocks and the atmosphere, this is tiny. This is a very small flux. It's very slow. So maybe this can be explaining very long-term changes. I mean, if you look at the actual amounts of carbon in the atmosphere, 600 gigatons, which is kind of 10 to the 9 tons, which is huge. But there's a lot more in rocks. So even though it's only going to change at a slow rate, it could potentially have a very large impact on the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. So the idea is that weathering is responsible for that chain exchange between the atmosphere and the ocean. So from the video, weathering is basically we're taking silicate rocks, which we can approximate to this formula here. We take carbonic acid, which forms when water and CO2 basically react together. So we have lots of CO2, we have lots of carbonic acid. And that can be directly from the atmosphere, or it can be in soils. So soils have got much, much more carbon dioxide in them because all of the organic matter is decaying and respiring. So we have much higher concentrations of carbonic acid in soils. Those things react together and form these dissolved thingies. Okay? Ooh. So if we actually look at the equations of that, okay, so this is the dissolution of CO2 with water. So the more CO2 we have, the more carbonic acid we have, the more acids we'll have. Now, if we get carbonate rocks, we take calcium carbonate, okay, and we are basically removing this carbonic acid. So if we remove carbonic acid, that will be lowering the concentration of CO2 in the system. Okay, so weathering of carbonate rocks removes CO2, but when that material gets into the ocean, when the calcium and the bicarbonate get into the ocean, those things will react together to form calcium carbonate, which releases CO2. So if the weathering of carbonate rocks is matched by precipitation of that calcium in the ocean, okay, the overall change will be nothing. It won't change CO2 at all. Okay? If these processes are not balanced, if we suddenly have a big increase in weathering, but the precipitation in the ocean can't catch up, that would draw down CO2 for a small time, but then precipitation in the ocean would increase the CO2. Now, with silicate rocks, it doesn't balance. So we take silicate rocks, we take CO2 and water, and we produce the same kind of things, dissolved ions. Okay? So that will remove CO2 from the atmosphere. Okay? We're using this as a reactant. It's not in the products. And when we take this stuff and precipitate it in the ocean, we do the same kind of series of reactions. We take silica and we produce opal over here. It doesn't really do anything to CO2. But we take carbon, calcium, and bicarbonate, and we produce calcium carbonate. That releases CO2. Okay, so it looks like it's giving up the CO2 that it took out of the atmosphere. But if you look at the balance of the equation, we need 2 CO2s to do the weathering, and we only release 1 from the precipitation, from the growing of basically shells and stuff in the ocean. So if we do lots of weathering of silicate rocks, that will lower atmospheric CO2, that will cool the climate. So it turns out, if we look at what causes the weathering rates to change, okay, so we've got temperature, we've got precipitation, and basically biological productivity, so how much plants there are and stuff like that. So if we increase temperature, the rates of weathering will increase. If we increase the precipitation, it means it'll be wetter, so we'll be able to do more weathering because these reactions require water. And if we have more biological activity, then that will mean there'll be more kind of soil, which will be able to produce more carbonic acid, and we'll do more weathering that way. So we have this situation where we have another feedback on climate. So if we maybe have a warmer climate, we'll increase temperature, precipitation, and the amount of vegetation. That will then increase the amount of weathering, and that will reduce the amount of CO2, okay, which will act against the initial change. So this is a negative feedback. It's acting against the initial change. It works exactly the same if you cool it. We'll have less weathering. Okay, we'll remove less CO2, so more will remain in the atmosphere, and that means we will reduce the amount of initial cooling. So the balance to that removal of CO2, if all the planet was doing was weathering and removing the CO2, then we'd run out of CO2 in the atmosphere and we'd get cold very quickly. CO2 is being added by volcanism. Okay, so if we increase the rate of seafloor spreading, we'll have more volcanism at the spreading ridge, and we'll also have more volcanism in island arcs. So the CO2 in the atmosphere is going to be a balance between the rates of CO2 production from this kind of stuff and the rates of removal from weathering. And the other thing that affects weathering, other than the amount of temperature and precipitation, all that kind of stuff, are the size of the rocks. Okay? If you grind your rocks up into small little bits, you increase the surface area, and then you can increase the weathering rate. So if you have mountain uplift, okay, which is a tectonic process, which is completely independent of climate, that means you'll increase rock fragmentation, and you'll increase weathering and CO2 removal. So this is an example. When we form a big supercontinent, so this was Pangaea forming 200 and something million years ago, lots of mountain forming events, big mountains, and importantly, these mountains are forming in a place on Earth where there is lots of rain. They're on the equator. It's hot. So it's a hot place, it's a wet place, and it's now a place with lots of teeny bits of rock. Okay? So this is going to massively increase the amount of weathering, okay, which is going to reduce atmospheric CO2. Okay? And that is here. Okay? This is this cooling down because we formed a big mountain chain and then started weathering the crap out of it. So we could look at, another period, which is kind of, I think this is the late Cretaceous. Oh, early Cretaceous. I even wrote it down, trying to remember what it is from the position of the continents. So we're having lots of mountain forming as this ocean here is closing. Does it lead to cooling? No, this was a period of extreme warming. So what's going on here? So mid-Cretaceous, average temperature, much warmer across all latitudes. One of the things we notice at this time is that you can see that lots of the continents are flooded. Okay? So there are two things that are important here. One, there's a reason they're flooded, and that is that the mid-ocean ridges, okay, there's lots of them in the ocean because lots of seafloor spreading at this time, which means that the rate of global volcanism was higher at this time. So we have more CO2 being pumped out into the atmosphere. So that's acting against the mountain building, removing CO2 from weathering, so we're adding more into the environment that way. The other thing is that we flooded all of these continental shelves in the tropics. If you do that, you'll tend to get lots of coral reefs forming. And the thing is, if you grow lots of coral reefs, I'll just switch back to the equation of funness. Right? Let's grow lots of coral reefs. That's this equation here. Or this equation. Growing coral reefs produces CO2. So if you flood the continental shelves, you'll promote even more CO2 going to the atmosphere. So that explains why this period was, although we had lots of mountain building, which are maybe drawing down CO2, we've got more volcanism and more coral reef growth, which is promoting CO2. Okay, so this is the idea that if we make this thing here go faster, the ridge gets bigger and we flood the shelves. Okay, so to summarize, gone a little bit over time, sorry about that. Proxies are what we use to reconstruct past climates. That's really important. And the important things with proxies is that they quite often record the local conditions. So you need to think about the spatial setting of your stuff. Weathering removes CO2. Okay? It's really important that you understand what those equations mean. If you don't, then bad times. Yeah, so I'll leave that. I won't leave that up for now. I just wanted to... so next week, you'll be going into the labs. So it's important that you're safe when you're in the labs. So I'll send out some information about what you should and should not be doing. So the kind of obvious things like, don't be a dick in the labs and that kind of stuff. But you'll need to be, when you arrive on Tuesday, you'll need to be properly dressed for going into the labs. I think most of you are properly dressed, but you need to be able to have all of your body covered. So kind of don't wear shorts or kind of like those ridiculous 3/4 length trousers. Because if you spill chemicals on your leg, then that's going to hurt your leg. If you've got your trousers, we can cut your trousers off. Right? So no kilts either. Right? Loose hair, lots of loose. Well, I quite like loose hair now, but loose hair, you've got to have something to tie your hair back with, or a hat, which would be good. So I'll send some more information about that. It'll all be in the handout anyway. So the other thing is, so for next time there is no video to watch for next time. So just turn up. It'll be fun. I'll be using puppets. But what I do want you to do is to first of all start looking at the exam feedback videos. So you should all have a look at those. And the other thing I want you to do is if you go to Learn. Okay, if you go to Learn, there's this thing that says Discussions here. Okay, if you go into that, there's now a discussion forum for my part of the course. So what I will be doing is I'll be posting a series of questions on here, and you can post questions as well. Yeah, sure, fine, whatever. I want you to look at those and start posting answers to them. I will comment on those answers, and it will be fun times. Okay, Gail, do you want to throw me out? Sorry,
That's all right. How are you?
Good. Good.
Right, what's this course you're doing?
Evolution of the Living Earth. It's,
Is it good?
yeah,